a big post from Thomas Macy, and it was, I just reintroduced End the Fed. Title, Federal Reserve Board Abolition Act, HR 1846. What this included was exactly what it states: ending the Fed. Americans would be better off if the Federal Reserve did not exist. The Fed devalues our currency by monetizing the debt, causing inflation. I bring this post up because if you guys do remember going all the way back to 2020, 2021, even prior to that, the biggest thing that we talked about with Ripple and even XRP was at some point in time, there not needing to be a Federal Reserve. Because again, if we're thinking about blockchain technology, if we're thinking about the way that this, technology will change the way that money moves around the world, what would be the point of the Fed? Now, do I think that the Federal Reserve is going to completely disappear? Do I think that the Fed is going to, get completely replaced? Not exactly. However, I do think that the Federal Reserve's position in the financial system will soon change in a drastic way. And they will no longer hold that high standard that they have currently, where they are a crucial piece of the system. I bring all of this up because of this. During this entire year, we were hearing talks about Jerome Powell getting replaced. There were 11 candidates to replace Powell at the Fed. We do have all of the names. Now, this was a big talking subject. One of the biggest things that we are hearing all throughout this year was how Jerome Powell is not doing his job. The Fed has failed at doing their job. They're too late. They're not doing anything, X, Y, and Z, right? And if we're thinking about this, right, if the Fed is doing a horrible job, if the Fed, ever since its inception, has completely killed the US dollar in terms of purchasing power, what is the point of the Fed? If they're not doing their job properly, if they're killing the dollar, wouldn't that mean that they are failing to do their job? They're doing a horrible job, unless this has always been the intended value coming from the Fed. Killing the dollar, devaluing the dollar, making sure that we have inflation to steal people's money. This could definitely be the focus. However, I don't believe that it was. This has been going on for almost over 100 years. Now, if we are thinking about this, let's go over here to this post from Smoke Dog, which did highlight a few things around the Fed. The Federal Reserve's David Endofato confirmed that clearing and settlement at the Fed can be delegated to a third-party player like Ripple. This explains Ripple's pursuit of a Fed master account to directly settle central bank money using XRP. Listen closely. Now listen closely to this video clip.
That is, people say, how can you trust, the Fed to do the bookkeeping? Like I said, my response is, well, you don't expect the Fed to kind of steal your money. If the Fed can print all the money at once, it's not going to mess around with your bookkeeping. So, we have this big spreadsheet, the blockchain if you want, but it's just managed by the Fed, and it's very cheap, much cheaper than Bitcoin. If you're willing to delegate the responsibility to a third party. But then the downsides to all of that, of course, is you'd actually, suppose you didn't want the Fed to be responsible for processing the payments. Suppose, the Fed will likely impose some KYC restrictions on some purchases. They might not process some purchases that you might want to undertake. And so it was at that point that I said, well, we could, if we wanted to, extend the concept one step further. I'm not saying that this is ever going to happen, but just conceptually, you could imagine not FedWire for all, but kind of like a Fed coin, where what the Fed would do is actually just issue these, Bitcoin-like objects, but and they would enforce a par exchange rate with the U.S. dollar. That would eliminate the exchange rate volatility. But they could delegate the clearing of these payments to some third party, some sort of Ripple-like protocol, or possibly even Bitcoin. We could delegate the responsibility of processing these electronic, Fedcoin payments to the miners. And the idea there would be,
And yeah, listen, if we're thinking about this logically, I mean, with stablecoins booming the way that they have been, with everything happening around crypto this year as well, these things are now starting to make a lot of sense. These things are now starting to have a real argument behind them. And I do think that we need to really put a lot of value behind certain ideas like this, because I know that a lot of people will say that they don't believe that this is ever going to happen. They don't see it happening ever. But if we go back just a couple years ago, if we were to talk about some of these things happening now, big banks jumping into the stablecoin boom, big banks telling us about how big tokenization will be, BNY Mellon, for an example, being the main custodian of ROUSD. Like, these things are insane. A few years ago, if I said that these things would have happened, people would have been like, dude, you're crazy. Well, yeah, now things are starting to align perfectly with those same thoughts that we had years ago, where we were talking about big banks jumping into crypto, big banks adopting crypto, stablecoins being massive. All of these things are happening in a huge way. Now, on top of that, when it comes to the Fed, I do think that the Fed will have to, at some point in time, tap into crypto in a huge way. And it kind of feels as if we're already starting to see that. I mean, you got to think about it like this, right? Fed Now is that new infrastructure that's in place that allows third-party players to get tapped into for instant payment services. This will completely change the way that money moves in the US-based financial system. Now, again, the main goal of this service was to tap into those third-party players. Now, if we're thinking about that, we go over here to this video clip. And this is from Subjective Views. As blockchain technology matures, enabling secure, real-time, and transparent financial infrastructure, the Fed could transition to a leaner role rather than hands-on monetary policy interventions like daily rate adjustments. Check this out.
Could you tell us a little more about the bill that you introduced, and about the Federal Reserve, what you think about the Federal Reserve?
Well, he was prophetic. I mean, the U.S. dollar has lost 97% of its value since the Fed was created, and they play central planner with our economy. Interest rates should be set by the market, by the private market, and we shouldn't have. What's funny is they say that the Federal Reserve is independent of the executive branch and the legislative branch. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury work hand in hand, like in lockstep, every minute of the day, arranging to finance our debt and things like that. And in fact, the people that run the Fed are oftentimes people who worked at Treasury or worked in the banking world. And it's a revolving door. Sometimes people go all the way through the door twice. They'll go from the Fed to the Treasury to private banking, back to the Fed and back to Treasury. So it's not at all independent. And what they do is they contrive what they think our interest rates should be, and they help monetize our debt. They loan money to banks, and then banks loan money to the United States Treasury. And it almost would be better if we just printed the money without these intermediaries if we were going to devalue our dollar. And at least you would have somebody you could throttle at the election, at the ballot box, for devaluing the currency. But here it's all through a shell game that it happens. And so we need to end the Federal Reserve. What's interesting, though, Mario, is their power is waning right now because they've played with the currency too much. I think it's funny that we blame China oftentimes here in the United States for manipulating their currency, while we do it every day, obviously. But what's happened is, as I said before, foreign government wealth funds are more reluctant to finance our debt, and so the interest rates have gone up. Our president has urged the Federal Reserve to lower their interest rate that they loan to banks. The problem is their control lever to the interest rates and the economy in general is connected with a rubber band. It's not a tight linkage. And so that rubber band is stretched about as far as it can go. If they were to lower interest rates, let's say 3%, they could probably lower them 0.5% or 1% and juice the economy a little bit. There would be a lot of mal effects. But let's say they tried to lower them 3%. That won't fly because people aren't going to pay 3% less for our debt. And we are one of the biggest markets or consumers of financial financing is the U.S. government. And so I think the Federal Reserve has less and less influence, even though the president wants to squeeze that lemon for all it's worth.
And of course, this is Thomas Macy regarding the Fed. I do think that with blockchain technology, with everything happening around stablecoins, the adoption of crypto itself, I feel as if the impact that the Fed is having, just like Thomas is saying, it's starting to drop. We're starting to see, if you will, dominance around the Fed drop significantly, because again, I don't think that we are going to need these big intermediaries in a new financial system that's dominated by blockchain technology, especially at a time where, if you think about instant payments, I've talked about this on multiple occasions with reserve currencies. Once you have instant settlement, you no longer need a reserve currency. The only reason why we need a reserve currency is we need something that holds stable value over a span of like 5, 7, 10 plus days. And the US dollar has always been that. This is where we start to kind of see all of the factors around this traditional system really breaking down. I mean, we don't need a reserve currency. We do not need the Fed. And this all changes once we have instant settlement. So again, I do think with blockchain technology maturing the way that it has been, with the adoption heating up around blockchain technology, I feel as if it's hurting the role of the Fed in a big way. And then, of course, yes, enter in Ripple, right? Ripple does have that big effect on the market. And what I mean by that is we think about the fact that Ripple is applying for a national bank charter license from the OCC, on top of the fact that they're also applying for a Fed master account. Now, we've already talked about this before. It's definitely a big one. It's definitely something that we need to watch for. But what's the impact of this? Well, I have over here from XRP Update. We have institutional rails incoming. Ripple is seeking Fed master account access, meaning direct settlement with the US Federal Reserve. No intermediaries, no friction, just trusted on-chain stable infrastructure for RLUSD. We look at what is a Fed master account. Now, the main thing that we're looking at here is the benefits. Hold deposits directly with the Federal Reserve. Great. Clear and settle payments without going through intermediaries' banks. Like when we think about this, this is cutting out those intermediaries. Access the US payment system directly like the FedWire, the Fed ACH, and instant settlement rails. Only licensed financial entities like national banks or trust banks can apply. So again, this is why you have the national bank charter application, as well as the Fed master account. It goes hand in hand. But we also think about the fact that back in April of this year, okay, the chair of the Federal Reserve was being interviewed by a Ripple advisory board member who is specifically there for RLUSD oversight. Check this out.
Well, let me move to something which is more about technological change and new kinds of instruments, cryptocurrencies. How do you see the potential for more favorable regulations coming on them and potential risks from that for the system?
So we went through a wave of failures and fraud and things like that were the headlines for a couple of years. And I think what you see now is, and during that period, by the way, we worked with Congress to try to get a legal framework for stable coins, which would have been a nice place to start. We were not successful. I think that the climate is changing and you're moving into sort of more mainstreaming of that whole sector. So Congress is again looking at both the Senate and the House are looking at a legal framework for stable coins. Depending on what's in it, that's a good idea. We need that. There isn't one now. And stablecoins are a digital product that could actually have fairly wide appeal and should contain consumer protections of the typical sorts and transparency. And that's what the Senate and the House are working on. So that's a positive thing. I also think some of the, we took a pretty conservative, and other bank regulators took an even more conservative perspective on the guidance and rules we imposed on banks. I think there'll be some loosening of that, and I think we'll try to do it in a way that preserves safety and soundness, but that permits and fosters appropriate innovation, but that does so in a way that again doesn't put consumers at risk in ways they don't understand or make banks less safe and sound.
And again, when we think about this, this is Jerome Powell addressing stablecoins, the role of stablecoins in the financial system. And this is an individual that is also the advisory board member having this discussion with Jerome Powell. This is why when we think about Ripple, it's not just it's just another blockchain-based company. No, we already know that FedNow offers connections to Volante and other Ripple partners that have spotlighted Ripple around ISO 20022 adoption. When we think about what's happening around our financial system, it's changing, it's evolving. And when we really look at the role of the Fed, when we look at the role of, a lot of these big players, these intermediaries, I do think that they'll start to kind of take a backseat role. We'll start to see these big players like Ripple have their infrastructure fully adopted in, because it's already happening, and that's going to be the main rails. So if we're thinking about Ripple replacing the Fed, yeah, you could definitely say that, Ripple will essentially replace the Fed. But it's not going to replace the Fed the way that everyone else believes so, like where Ripple basically becomes the new Fed. I just think that the Fed itself is going to take more of a backseat role, and companies like Ripple or even projects like